There's a strange stillness in Kentucky's forgotten coal towns. At first glance, they look like ruins, just wood, stone, and rust. But if you stand still long enough, you feel it, the weight of lives lived here, the shadows of miners who never returned, the families who waited in vain. These ghost towns are more than abandoned places, they're stories buried in the mountains, stories of sacrifice, struggle, and survival. And as I walked through them, it was as if the past whispered in every step I took. If you enjoy exploring forgotten places and true haunting stories, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more. 1 Blue Heron, Kentucky. I still remember the first time I walked into Blue Heron, deep inside the Daniel Boone National Forest. The trees closed in around me as the road narrowed, and for a moment it felt like I was driving back in time. When I finally stepped out of my car, there was no sound except the river below and the wind pressing gently through the trees. It was hard to believe that this quiet place was once alive with the voices of coal miners, their families, and children running along the wooden walkways. The town was built in 1937, and for nearly 25 years men worked the mines here, pulling coal from the dark tunnels carved into the earth. They came home each night covered in dust, tired but proud. Their wives kept small homes tidy, often with nothing more than a wood stove and a few pieces of furniture. Life was simple, but it was life built around the mine. Standing on the reconstructed tipple, I could almost hear the rattle of coal cars moving across the tracks. I closed my eyes and imagined the shouts of miners echoing through the valley, the constant hammering of machinery, and the smell of burning coal. But when I opened my eyes again, there was nothing, only silence. What struck me most was how quickly it all ended. In 1962, the mine shut down. The coal company pulled out, and with it went the jobs, the money, and the reason for the town to exist. Families packed up whatever they could carry and left. Many never came back. Blue Heron slipped into the woods, swallowed by vines, rot, and time. Walking past the ghostly outlines of the old houses, I felt a heaviness in my chest. These weren't just buildings, they were people's lives. Every empty frame told a story of someone's laughter, someone's struggle, someone's last night in town before they left forever. The coal dust may have settled, but the memories still clung to the air. As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, the shadows grew longer and the air colder. For a brief second, I thought I saw a figure at the far end of the path, standing silently where the entrance to the mine once was. My heart skipped. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Maybe it was just the fading light. Maybe it was my mind pulling ghosts out of history. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Blue Heron isn't truly empty. It holds the voices of the miners who worked themselves to the bone, and perhaps of those who never made it out of the tunnels alive. Leaving that place, I carried a deep respect for the lives that were lived there and a sorrow for how suddenly it was all taken away. Even today, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the silence of Blue Heron. It's the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. 2 Bon Jellicoe, Kentucky. The road to Bon Jellicoe wasn't easy to find. Hidden away in Whitley County, the place is nearly erased from modern maps, as if the world wants to forget it ever existed. I parked near a patch of overgrown grass, and the silence around me was unsettling. Only the sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves filled the air. It was hard to imagine that over 1,000 people once called this place home. Bon Jellicoe was born in 1912 when the coal company opened its mines here. For 25 years, the town lived and breathed coal. Miners walked these paths every morning, their lamps glowing in the dark before the first rays of sunlight touched the hills. Their wives cooked meals in small wooden houses, while children ran barefoot across the dirt streets. There was laughter, church bells on Sundays, and the rhythm of trains carrying coal away. But as I stood there, all I could see were scattered foundations and faint traces of what used to be streets. Time had stripped the town down to bones. The forest had reclaimed what man once built. I found myself staring at a broken stone wall and wondered, whose house had stood here? What dreams had been built behind these walls, only to vanish when the mines closed in 1937? As I walked deeper into the brush, I felt the weight of history pressing on me. I could almost hear the coughs of miners, black lungs stealing their breath. I imagined the fear in their families' eyes whenever a siren wailed from the mine. Because everyone knew that sirens meant something terrible had happened underground. Some miners returned home at night, some never did. That thought clung to me like the damp Kentucky air. I sat for a while on a moss-covered stone, letting the silence speak. In that moment, I realized Bongelico wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten. Entire lives, entire generations, had simply been left behind. I thought of the children who grew up here, who never imagined their hometown would one day disappear. Did they miss it when they left? Did they ever come back to visit the graves of their fathers who never made it out of the mine? The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow through the trees, and I felt both sadness and gratitude. Sadness for the lives that struggled and ended here, gratitude that I could stand in the ruins and remember them. Bongelico may not exist on modern maps, but walking through its silence, I knew it still lived in memory. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the miners were still here, not in body but in spirit, watching, waiting, reminding anyone who came that this town once mattered. And maybe, by telling their story, I had given them a small voice again. 3 Packard, Kentucky. I found myself standing at the edge of what was once Packard, Kentucky. The gravel road I followed had slowly given way to dirt, and then to nothing but a trail swallowed by weeds and trees. The forest here felt heavy, as if it was guarding secrets no one had asked about in decades. I stopped, listening. There was no sign of life. Yet, in my mind, I could almost hear the faint sound of a train whistle, the kind that once carried coal away from this little town. Packard came alive in the early 1900s, when the coal company opened its camp deep in Bell County. Back then, this hollow wasn't silent. It was filled with men in hard hats, their faces streaked with black dust, and women who did their best to make homes in the company's simple wooden houses. Children went to school here, played in the fields, and probably never thought their town could vanish. But today, Packard is nothing more than a whisper of what it used to be. Walking through the woods, I stumbled across the remains of an old foundation, half buried under moss. I crouched down, touching the cold stone. It was rough, broken, but it told me something real had stood here once. A house? A store? Maybe even a church. Whatever it had been, it was someone's world. Someone had cooked meals here, laughed here, cried here. And then, one day, it was gone. It's strange how quickly silence replaces noise. By the 1940s, as the mines declined, families began to leave Packard. Without coal, the town had no heartbeat. The school closed, the houses emptied, and the railroad stopped its runs. Those who stayed behind couldn't fight the tide. Eventually, Packard was abandoned completely, left to rot into the hillsides. As I stood there, I thought about the miners who walked into those dark tunnels each morning, never knowing if they'd walk out again. Some did, their lungs filling slowly with coal dust, while others weren't so lucky. Mining was never just a job, it was survival, but it came with a price. That price still lingers in the silence of Packard. I sat on the edge of the trail as the wind picked up, shaking the trees above me. For just a second, I felt like I wasn't alone. The air seemed thicker, charged with something unseen. Maybe it was only my imagination, but I couldn't help feeling the miners' presence still lingered here, as though Packard itself refused to let go of its past. When I finally left, I looked back one last time. The woods had swallowed the town, but not its memory. In the quiet, I realized Packard's story wasn't truly lost. It lives on in the land, in the ruins, and in anyone willing to stop and listen to the echoes that remain. For Bell's Mines, Kentucky. I drove along a narrow road in Crittenden County, chasing a name that barely appears on modern maps, Bell's Mines. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. The sound of my car faded until even that seemed too loud for a place like this. When I finally stepped out, I felt as though I had crossed into another world, one where the past clings stubbornly to the earth. Bell's Mines was born in the early 1800s. Miners came here seeking coal and iron, carving their lives into the hills along the Ohio River. For decades, men swung pickaxes underground while women kept the home fires burning above. Children learned to live with the distant rumble of explosions and the ever-present fear that one day their fathers might not return. As I wandered through the overgrown fields, I stumbled on the old cemetery. Weather-worn stones leaned toward the ground, names almost erased by time. Some of the markers were so small they could only have belonged to children. Standing there, I felt a chill, not from the wind but from the realization that this wasn't just an abandoned mining camp, it was a place soaked in struggle and sorrow. They say Bell's Mines was haunted, and walking those paths, I could understand why. Locals whisper of strange lights seen in the woods and voices carried on the wind, especially near the old church grounds. As the sun dipped lower, the woods grew darker, and the silence pressed harder on my chest. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see a miner's lantern glowing in the shadows. What broke my heart most was thinking of the families who lived here, building lives around a mine that eventually abandoned them. When the coal ran dry and the company left, so did the people. Houses collapsed, stores rotted, and nature moved in. What remained were graves, memories, and the kind of emptiness that refuses to let go. I paused by a crumbling stone wall, letting my hand rest on the cool surface. My thoughts drifted to the miners who entered the tunnels and never returned, buried forever beneath the ground they once worked. Their families had to leave, carrying grief with them but leaving the bones of the town behind. As I walked back toward my car, a gust of wind rattled the trees, and for an instant, I thought I heard a faint voice carried through the branches. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was Bell's Mines reminding me that this place, though forgotten by many, still holds the weight of every soul that once called it home. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bell's Mines wasn't truly empty. The land remembers. And in its silence, it tells the stories we cannot afford to forget. 5 Cumberland Falls Mining Camps, Kentucky. The first time I went looking for the old mining camps near Cumberland Falls, I wasn't sure I'd even find them. Tourists visit the waterfall in thousands, calling it the Niagara of the South, but very few people know that hidden in those surrounding hills once stood small coal camps, entire little worlds now gone. I left the main trail and followed a narrow path into the woods. The roar of the falls faded, replaced by the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Slowly, I began to notice the signs, fragments of stone foundations, rusted metal pieces, and the faint outline of what once might have been a road. To anyone else, it would look like nothing. But I knew I was walking through the skeleton of a place where miners and their families once lived. It's hard to imagine life here. The camps were rough, simple wooden shacks built close to the mines. The men would rise before dawn, lamps strapped to their helmets, and vanish into the darkness underground. Women cooked, washed, and tried to keep the homes warm. Children played by the riverbanks, their laughter echoing off the cliffs, even though they all knew the mines had a hunger that sometimes swallowed their fathers whole. I stopped near a crumbling chimney, one of the few pieces still standing. Running my fingers along the cold stone, I felt an ache in my chest. How many meals had been cooked over this fire? How many stories told at the end of a long day? And then, how quickly did it all end when the mines closed? The coal companies left once the seams ran thin. Families scattered, carrying only what they could. The houses collapsed, the roads disappeared, and the forest claimed the rest. What was once a bustling cluster of life became nothing but whispers in the shadow of the great waterfall. As the evening light dimmed, the forest around me grew heavy with silence. I swear I heard the distant ring of a hammer striking metal, faint and far away. I froze, listening, my heart beating hard. There was nothing. only the rush of the river in the distance. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, or maybe the land still carried the echoes of men who never returned from the mines. Before leaving, I stood on a ridge where I could hear both the waterfall and the silence of the abandoned camps. The contrast struck me deeply, one a symbol of nature's endless power, the other a reminder of how fragile human life can be. The miners built their homes here, worked themselves into the ground, and vanished almost without a trace. As I walked back toward the tourist trails, I realized most people who visit Cumberland Falls never think about those camps. But I had seen them. I had felt them. And I knew I would never forget the ghosts that still linger in the woods nearby. 6 Himmlerville, Kentucky. Driving through Martin County, I had to remind myself that Himmlerville was real. Most people have never heard of it, and even fewer could point to where it once stood. But as I followed the winding roads into the valley, I could feel a kind of presence in the hills, as if the land remembered the lives that once filled this forgotten town. Himmlerville wasn't like most coal camps. It was founded in 1919 by Hungarian immigrants who came here with big dreams. They didn't just build houses, they built a community. There was a post office, a bank, a church, and even a newspaper printed in Hungarian. For a while, it must have felt like home, far from the old country, but close enough in spirit to carry their traditions forward. As I walked the overgrown paths, I tried to imagine what it must have looked like back then. Children laughing in the streets, women hanging laundry in the sun, miners leaving each morning in groups, lamps glowing like stars in the early dawn. Himmlerville wasn't just a coal town, it was hope carved into the mountains. But dreams here didn't last. In the 1920s, disaster struck. A flood swept through the valley, destroying homes, drowning hopes, and leaving behind nothing but mud and ruin. Families who had worked so hard to build this town were forced to watch everything collapse in front of them. And when the coal company faltered soon after, it was the final blow. Himmlerville was abandoned. Standing by a patch of stone that might once have been part of the bank, I felt a heaviness settle over me. The silence was thick, and I could almost hear the ghost of voices speaking a language foreign to these Kentucky hills. I thought about the miners who never made it out of the flooded shafts, about the children who left and never came back, about the families torn apart by something they couldn't control. The strangest thing was the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air carried a weight, like the echoes of those who had lost everything still lingered here. For just a moment, I thought I caught the faint sound of singing. Maybe a hymn, maybe just the wind carrying a memory through the valley. It sent a chill down my spine. When I finally left Himmlerville, I looked back one last time. The forest had taken it all, the houses, the streets, even the dreams. But the story remained, written in the soil and in the silence. Himmlerville was more than a ghost town, it was a reminder of how fragile hope can be, and how quickly it can be washed away. Even now, when I think of that place, I can still feel the sorrow of a town that tried to build a future but became nothing more than a memory. 7 Barthel, Kentucky. The first time I stepped into Barthel, I felt something different in the air. Unlike other abandoned coal towns that have crumbled into dust and memory, Barthel still stands, or at least, pieces of it do. Preserved and reconstructed, it feels like walking into a time capsule, a place where the past hasn't been erased but carefully held in place for anyone willing to listen. Barthel was founded in 1902, tucked away in McCreary County. Back then, it wasn't just a camp, it was a lifeline for hundreds of miners and their families. Coal was the heartbeat, the reason for every clapboard house, every school lesson, every meal cooked over a wood stove. As I walked along the wooden walkways, I ran my hand across the weathered boards. I tried to picture the miners heading out before dawn, lamps flickering on their helmets, their boots heavy with mud. The women would stand in the doorways of these same houses, watching them go, praying silently for their safe return. Every morning was a gamble, some men returned at night, but not all. The preserved company store still stands, its shelves lined with old-fashioned goods. I stared at the worn counters and thought about the families who bought everything on credit, their paychecks going right back into the company's hands. Life here was never easy. Coal gave them food, but it also took their health, their breath, and sometimes, their lives. Out near the mine entrance, I paused. The tunnel yawned open like a dark mouth, silent now but once alive with the noise of picks, drills, and men shouting over the roar. I stepped closer, peering inside. It was cold, damp, and unsettling. For a second, I imagined being down there, deep under the mountain, knowing that one wrong blast, one cave-in, could bury me forever. The thought sent a shiver racing down my spine. Yet, Barthel isn't entirely forgotten. Unlike so many other ghost towns, people have worked to keep it alive as a historic site. Tourists come, school groups visit, and the stories of the miners are told again and again. Still, even with the preservation, you can feel the sorrow here. The buildings may stand, but the laughter of children and the voices of families are long gone. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the air grew cooler, and a stillness settled over the town. I closed my eyes and for just a moment, I swore I could hear the faint clang of a hammer, the distant roll of a coal cart, and the echo of footsteps long since silenced. Leaving Barthel, I carried with me a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for the lives lived and lost here, gratitude that their story hasn't been buried completely. Barthel may be quiet now, but it still speaks to anyone willing to walk its paths and listen closely. 8 Eolia, Kentucky. When I first drove into Eolia, Kentucky, I almost missed it. Hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the road wound through thick forests and mist that clung to the hillsides like old secrets. Eolia isn't like the preserved mining towns where buildings are carefully maintained, it feels more like a memory, slowly being swallowed by nature. Coal once defined everything here. In the early 1900s, this little town thrived because of the black rock buried under the mountains. Miners worked endless shifts, their hands calloused, their lungs filling with coal dust they couldn't escape. Families built their lives around the company's promise of steady work, even though everyone knew the danger lurking underground. Walking along what used to be the main road, I found broken foundations hidden under vines, the skeleton of a house half collapsed, and rusted machinery scattered like bones of another era. It was strangely quiet, no hum of trucks, no children's laughter, only the wind pushing through the trees. I stood there for a long moment, trying to imagine the sound of a bustling town where now there was nothing but silence. Locals I met on my way told me stories passed down through generations. They spoke of miners who went in and never came back, accidents buried under official reports, and families who packed up overnight when the mines finally shut down. One older man said his father worked in Eolia's mine until black lung disease forced him out. He gave his whole life to the company, the man told me, his eyes distant, and all he got back was a cough that never went away. I wandered to the edge of what used to be the mining camp. The mountains towered above me, dark and endless, their silence heavy. Standing there, I felt both awe and sorrow. It was beautiful, yes, but I couldn't shake the thought of the men who spent their days deep inside those mountains, never really seeing the sun. The weight of that sacrifice pressed on me. As evening fell, fog rolled in low and thick, blurring the outlines of the old houses. For a moment, I felt as though I wasn't alone. My mind played tricks, I could almost hear the faint clang of metal tools, the echo of boots hitting the wooden walkways, the soft murmur of voices carried by the wind. It was haunting, but not terrifying. More like the past refusing to be forgotten. When I finally left Eolia, I looked back one last time at the mountains. They stood tall and silent, holding within them the stories of countless miners who gave their lives to the coal seams. The town may be abandoned, its buildings falling away, but in those hills, the memory of Eolia still breathes. 9 Eerie, Kentucky. When I first heard of Eerie, I was surprised that few people even knew it existed. Hidden near the Green River in Muhlenberg County, Eerie was once the site of a bold dream, an iron and coal town meant to bring industry and prosperity to Kentucky. But as I stood among the overgrown fields and faint outlines of old structures, I could feel how quickly dreams can fade. Back in the mid-1800s, wealthy Scottish investors tried to build a thriving iron industry here. They imagined a bustling town where miners, iron workers, and their families would create a new future. But what I saw when I walked through the land was the exact opposite, just traces, foundations eaten away by moss, and the quiet hush of the forest reclaiming everything. I bent down and touched a piece of crumbling stone that might once have been part of the furnace. It felt cold and rough, like holding history itself. Standing there, I tried to picture the heat, the fire, the endless clang of iron being worked. Men would have labored until their bodies ached, their sweat mixing with soot, their lungs filled with the dust of their labor. Yet all of it ended in failure. The soil wasn't right, the iron wasn't pure enough, and the vision of Eerie collapsed before it ever truly began. The strangest thing about walking through Eerie is the silence. It's not the heavy, sorrowful silence of a town emptied by tragedy, but rather the quiet of something unfinished, like a song that stopped mid-verse. I felt an odd sadness, not for lives lost in disaster, but for the people who believed so strongly in this place and left with nothing when it all fell apart. I spoke with a local historian who told me how families tried to hold on, turning back to coal when iron failed, but it never brought the town to life again. Eventually, people moved on, chasing work elsewhere. All that remains today are stories, whispers of what might have been, and the land itself, stubborn, green, and indifferent to human plans. As the sun lowered across the river, casting golden light on the trees, I felt a strange calm. Eerie isn't haunted by ghosts in the traditional sense, but it is haunted by ambition, by dreams that never quite reached the world. Looking at the ruins, I thought about how fragile human efforts can be, how entire towns can rise and fall on the promise of one idea. Walking back to my car, I felt grateful to have stood there, to have witnessed what little remains. Eerie may not echo with miners' boots or families' voices anymore, but the land remembers. And if you pause long enough, you can almost hear the distant hum of dreams that once burned bright in this forgotten corner of Kentucky. 10 Partridge Coal Camps, Kentucky. When I arrived in Partridge, Kentucky, it didn't feel like stepping into a town, it felt like entering a memory. The coal camps here were once full of life, rows of simple houses built for miners and their families, the sound of children running through the dusty yards, and the steady hum of work that kept everything going. Today, only fragments remain, swallowed by time and silence. The camps were built in the early 1900s, when coal companies carved into the mountains and promised steady work. Families moved here with hope, believing the dark seams beneath the hills would give them a future. As I stood on the cracked foundation of what must have been a small home, I tried to picture the lives lived here. A mother cooking supper on a wood stove, miners coming home exhausted but grateful they made it out alive, kids chasing each other until the sun dipped behind the mountains. Walking deeper into the old camp area, I came across rusted machinery, half-buried rail tracks, and broken timbers that once carried coal carts down the hills. My boots crunched on gravel that had likely been walked by hundreds of men heading to and from the mines. I stopped and imagined the morning shift, lanterns glowing faintly in the dawn, boots dragging with fatigue, voices low and tense. Every man knew that when he entered the dark belly of the earth, there was no guarantee he'd walk out again. I met a local who told me his grandfather worked in the Partridge mines. He said the old man rarely spoke about it, but when he did, his voice would tremble. The dangers weren't just cave-ins or explosions, but also the slow, suffocating disease of black lung. He coughed until his last day, the man told me quietly. Hearing that, I felt the weight of what these miners carried, not just coal, but the burden of shortened lives. Standing at the edge of the forest, where nature had reclaimed most of the camp, I felt an eerie quiet settle over me. The trees rustled gently, but beneath that calm, I thought I could hear faint echoes, the swing of a hammer, the distant laughter of children, the low rumble of a coal cart. It was as if the land itself refused to forget the people who once gave everything here. As the sun set, shadows stretched long across the abandoned grounds. I lingered, feeling a mix of sadness and respect. Partridge isn't just ruins, it's a reminder of sacrifice, of lives shaped and scarred by coal. The miners may be gone, their families scattered, but their presence lingers in every stone, every rusted rail, every whisper carried by the mountain wind. Leaving Partridge, I carried with me the quiet ache of their story, a story written in sweat, coal dust, and the silence that remains.